So good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to see you, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing you in person soon, hopefully. But at least I'm glad to see you here at the Emerging Scholar talk tonight. My name is Ruth von Barnow, and I'm the director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. It is a very special tonight to introduce our speaker, because it's not only in my capacity as a director, but also as her former advisor, or Doktormutter, as we say in German. Leah, when she joined the program, the Carolina Duke graduate program in German studies in 2015, we soon had a conversation about Yiddish literature, which she explored further while working with Jonathan Hess. And after Jonathan's untimely passing, she continued to work with me. She defended very successfully her dissertation in spring 2021, and she currently teaches as a visiting assistant professor of German and European Studies in the Department of Modern Languages at Knox College in Galesburg. Leah has published already several articles, including Ein poetischer Schleier, Bildung and Failed Conversion in Fanny Lewald's Jenny, and the papal game, Telling a Jewish Story from the Meisebuch, Isaac Mayer Dick and Markus Lehmann. She's currently developing her dissertation into a book project titled Tales of the Jewish Daughter, Love, Reading and Rebellion in Modern German Jewish and Yiddish Literature. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing one of her chapters of this, or hopefully her future chapters, in her talk tonight, titled A Curious Daughter, The Excess of Reading and Desire in Karl Emil Franzos, the Shylock of Barnow. Leah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's nice to return to my alma mater, even though it wasn't necessarily under the circumstances one would hope, but it's also good to be able to see you while also being in Illinois. So I'll go ahead and get started, and I'll share my screen. So I want to begin today's talk by situating my work on Karl Emil Franzos' fiction within my larger book project, which Ruth mentioned. I'll start not with one of Franzos' short stories, but rather with a painting. This 1866 painting, entitled Sabbath Rest, is by Moritz Daniel Oppenheim, a German Jewish painter known for his depiction of family life in the growing German Jewish middle class of the 19th century. Jonathan Hess's 2010 landmark study, Middlebrow Literature and the Making of German Jewish Identity, opens with this painting because it brings together key questions facing German Jews during this period of religious and cultural transition in the 19th century. Here, we find ourselves outside the home in the Jewish quarter, or the Judengasse, where an older woman, hair covered, sits hunched over a bulky text, likely the Zenerena, the Yiddish quote-unquote women's Bible. Next to the woman, her son and grandson rest. The grandson also holds a book, perhaps a religious Jewish text he is studying. While this display of reading and rest from reading takes place in a semi-public space, another scene of reading takes place inside the home. In the background of the image, a young woman, more fashionably dressed, reads a dainty book alone, ensconced in the private sphere. As Daniel Barnow notes, reading in the Bible and the Talmud occurs in public social spaces such as the forum, the synagogue, or the house of study. In contrast, Christian Europe privileges the two social sites for the practice of reading, the study and the bedroom. From the monk's cell, or the scholar's study, to the Lesesucht, or reading mania, beginning in the 18th century, these are the dominant modes of reading that traditional Jewish practice confronts. In Oppenheim's painting, communal reading gradually gives way to private reading in the middle-class home. The 19th century was a time when German Jewish literature helped to negotiate the transitions and tensions between the traditional past and the formulation of a Jewish present. This scene takes place during a period of rapid social and religious transformation among Jews in the German-speaking world in the 19th century, where they chose to speak German instead of Yiddish, when Reform Judaism changed religious practice, when Jewish families embraced the bourgeois cult of domesticity and Jewish women moved from the margins into a prominent position of religious and cultural life, as noted by Benjamin Maria Bader. This painting also serves as an ideal entry point into my work, but I wanted to zoom into the figure in the background. It is significant that this young woman, the daughter, concealed in the home, reading for pleasure, donning the latest fashions. A concern with the young woman reading alone is part of a larger discourse on quote unquote reading mania and the dangers of reading for pleasure. In Oppenheim's painting, what this figure represents is a persistent literary topos of the Jewish daughter in her move away from tradition, where the Jewish daughter exhibits an unsanctioned penchant for non-Jewish reading and culture, and in doing so, displays unsanctioned desire. This twofold concern is significant because it appears in a wide variety of texts, from philo-Semitic dramas and their anti-Semitic parodies, to popular novels, to nostalgic tales of Jewish ghetto life, to Yiddish fiction that has entered into wider popular culture. My research considers the pivotal role of the Jewish daughter in a variety of both German Jewish and Yiddish literary works that confront the challenges of Judaism in the modern world. So I'm interested in the poetics of the Jewish daughter figure at the center of these texts and what this fixation with the daughter's learning encodes. What is at stake when the Jewish daughter is lost or strays, whether intellectually or romantically? This goes beyond the premise of halakhic or Jewish legal conception of matrilineality. This project looks at what happens when traditional Judaism meets the Protestant ideals of the new German middle class that emerged in the mid-18th century. And a key concern of Judaism and gender that informs my study is also a history of gender division of language and education in traditional Judaism. The Ashkenazi Jewish community of Europe has historically been characterized by internal bilingualism, in which Hebrew is considered the holy tongue of religious study, typically by men, and Yiddish, the Ashkenazi Jewish vernacular, the feminine language of the home. Naomi Seidman theorizes these relations as part of a, quote, sexual linguistic system, unquote. Iris Perush has demonstrated how Ashkenazi women's exclusion from traditional Jewish scholarship created new opportunities to interface with the non-Jewish world of Eastern Europe and create subversive communities of literacy. And in Western Europe, literature and linguistic shift also played a central role in shaping the transformations of Jewish life. Yiddish, a language that grew out of Middle High German approximately 1,000 years ago and is written in Hebrew characters, was no longer the dominant language of the home among Ashkenazi Jews in the German-speaking lands by the 19th century, while it remained the dominant Jewish vernacular in Eastern Europe. So I consider these tensions by looking at both German and Yiddish literature, exploring how the simultaneous intellectual and romantic rebellion of the daughter is a literary language for articulating the challenges facing Jewish tradition, from the early Jewish Enlightenment, called the Haskalah, until the early 20th century. My project, currently entitled Tales of the Jewish Daughter, as Ruth mentioned, focuses on the recurrent paradigm of the father-daughter conflict, borrowing from the bourgeois tragedy, in confronting shifts in the social order. I trace the role of the Jewish daughter figure in a range of literary texts, from Western Yiddish plays to popular German fiction of the 19th century to Sholem Aleichem's Tevye, the Dairyman stories. I then conclude by thinking about how the issue of the disobedient daughter continues to serve as a language for talking about changing social and religious norms in contemporary media. And today I will present a piece of research on author Karl Emil Franzos' contribution to ghetto fiction, a genre of German Jewish literature popular in the 19th century that depicts traditional Jewish life outside the urban centers. And just to give a sense of how expansive the German-speaking and reading culture was, Franzos was born here in 1847 in the city of Chortkov in Galician Podolia, then the Austrian Empire and now present-day Ukraine. He was the son of a physician who rejected traditional Judaism and embraced German education and the ideals of the Enlightenment. Franzos became a well-regarded fiction writer in his day, publishing stories on Jewish life in the rural regions in which he grew up. And the author was a self-proclaimed promoter of Bildung, the German ideal of self-cultivation and education. He strongly identified with German nationalism and distanced himself from the world of Eastern European Jewry and the Yiddish language. In his work, Franzos often used the Eastern European setting as a foil to a German Jewry ostensibly steeped in enlightened culture. The author adapts a pseudo-ethnographic approach to his writing in which he considers Eastern Europe, in his words, only partially civilized, and positions himself as a mediator between Eastern and Western Europe. The theme of liminality and this in-between in Franzos' own biography carries throughout his fictional work. His literary career was largely built on a notion of Eastern Europe as only half educated, and that German language literature and cultural ideals would remedy this. The author is perhaps best known for his 1876 collection of stories entitled From Half Asia, Cultural Scenes from Galicia, Bukovina, Southern Russia, and Romania. His signature coinage, quote, half Asia, unquote, refers to what Franzos contends are the regions located between the enlightened, cultured Western world and the exotic, uncivilized lands of Asia. The concept of Eastern Europe itself, according to Larry Wolff, is largely an invention of the Enlightenment, a space that was both adjacent to Enlightenment culture and an object of Orientalism. By naming this swath of Europe, quote, half Asia, unquote, Franzos characterized the area as halfway between his beloved, quote, educated Europe, unquote, and the, quote, dreary steppe through which the Asiatic treks, unquote. And the opening tale of this collection of short stories, The Jews of Barnow, published in 1877, is The Shylock of Barnow, which I'll talk about today. Here, Franzos returns to a fictional town featured in From Half Asia and warns against the dangers of a denial of secular education by staging the ill-fated space of liminality between illiteracy and a complete embrace of Bildung. In this text, the pursuit of reading takes shape in the form of the Jewish daughter's reading mania, this phenomenon I mentioned in German known as Lesesucht, literally reading addiction. Beginning in the 18th century, this purported pathological desire to read for pleasure was critiqued as a behavior counter to the Enlightenment project. In showing a pathological mode of reading, Franzos traces a treacherous path toward and leading from what he calls, quote, half Bildung, unquote, a condition cast as more dangerous than ignorance. This in-between state of education is analogous to the geographic, cultural, and social in-between status of Jews in Eastern Europe that characterizes his larger project. And I argue that the portrayal of this form of partial education acts as an indictment of the Eastern European cultural condition that Franzos critiques, while also invoking an anxiety toward the attainment of a modern bourgeois respectability and of a perceived cultural ideal. A liaison between the traditional and the secular world, Franzos's so-called Orient, and the modern world, the Jewish daughter operates in a liminal space and thus disrupts the constraint of either category. I demonstrate how the overlaying of the daughter's intellectual and erotic desire in the form of reading triggers a drive toward containing the social disruption she embodies. Franzos sets his story in the fictional Galician town of Barnow, likely drawing on his own birthplace, which he considered east of the German centers of culture and power. The titular figure of the Shylock of Barnow is a designation from the long stereotyped Jewish character Shylock in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. This story's Shylock refers to the reactionary central figure Moses Freudenthal, a wealthy and prominent citizen of Barnow. The widower Moses raises his only child Esther and attempts to constrain her to a traditional Jewish education for women, knowledge of basic prayers, and literacy for taking care of the home. However, Esther's uncle Sholem, who himself once dabbled in secular texts and Christian scripture, but returned to the fold, takes Esther's education into his own hands, introducing her to secular texts. Esther displays a, quote, consuming desire for knowledge and insight, unquote, reading and learning voraciously until her father confiscates her books. Esther's insatiable desire for reading and its tragic outcome becomes the stuff of local Barnow gossip, relayed in the story to a group of party guests by the anti-Semitic wife of a local judge. Esther's unsanctioned, impassioned reading is framed as leading to her departure when she pursues a non-Jewish nobleman. When she leaves, her father lowers her casket, which is empty, into the ground. After Esther is abandoned by the count that she pursues, she's found dead on Moses' doorstep. And this tragic ending of the Shylock story stages the fears and anxieties and uncertainties embedded within the feminine engagement with secular letters. Esther's gateway to unsanctioned love, a desire for a Christian man, is secular education. By initiating young Esther into the world of belles lettres, the uncle Shloma positions himself as an enlightening figure who will extricate her from the darkness of conservatism and the intellectual restrictions therein. As Shloma shines a light in the form of German literacy, Esther becomes consumed by desire to read, sitting day and night buried in books. The wife of the judge observes Esther's new growing penchant for reading and comments that, while beautiful, she becomes, quote, hysterical and depraved, a fool for novels, unquote. The judge's wife's description of Esther taps into a larger discourse on the dangers, both physiological and moral, of reading. Her observation that she is, in German, überspannt, in fact encompasses a range of meanings, from hysterical and overexcited to fanciful and quixotic, and each depicts a young woman who has lost control or challenged a set of constraints. To the present-day observer, the solitary reader is an embodiment of coyness and good behavior. In the 18th and 19th centuries, however, silent reading was understood for what practice hid beneath. The act of reading alone and a concern with reading mania were illustrative of a network of fears surrounding the regulation of both the mind and body. Silent reading and reading for pleasure had also taken root by the 18th century. And this century also saw the proliferation of pedagogical literature that was concerned with the moral and psychosexual effects of reading on adolescents. At the same time, this period saw the general increase in literary production. By the second half of the 18th century, there was simply more reading material available to the public. The book market now offered a greater range of fictional literature that could be read for leisure. The reading debates that gained momentum beginning in the late 18th century thus centered around fiction, an unregulated space in which young readers could engage with new emotional worlds. And reading fiction was critiqued on moral, physiological, and medical grounds. 18th and 19th century contemporaries insisted that reading for pleasure and solitude was linked to masturbation, an independent act that, according to Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, threatens, quote, the orders of propriety and property, unquote, by escaping the societal, quote, narrative of reproduction, unquote. The anxiety towards self-pleasuring was articulated in terms of a general concern for both physical and mental health, irrespective of gender. Even 19th century German Jewish newspapers explicitly took up this concern with reading for pleasure. For example, Ludwig Philippson, a Reform rabbi and newspaper editor who often published Franzos's work, writes in 1855 on the dangers of reading novels and warns parents to protect their children's purity in the face of this epidemic. Although medical and pedagogical literature discussed young women and men alike, special attention was given to the young women who read. Anxieties toward the act of women reading in privacy dovetail with the conception of reading as a space of unsanctioned love. In pedagogical texts around 1800, for example, the model female reader would be the rational reader of Bildung, who fulfills a, quote, Rousseauian model of femininity, unquote, in contrast to the unrestrained, quote, addicted female reader of novels, unquote. By contrast, the German literary canon has given much attention to the educated young man who reads as part of his own personal growth, most notably in the form of the Bildungsroman. Whereas young men can be figures of measured growth and self-improvement, the young female figure has operated as a model of what might go wrong in this process. Reading might serve as a tool of edification, but reading in excess can lead to detachment from reality and thus the ability to self-regulate. Esther's solitary reading creates opportunities to blur the boundaries between reality and fiction, a recurrent critique made by Enlightenment pedagogues of the dangers of recreational reading. In this way, Esther, the reader of novels, subverts the Enlightenment ideal of a middle-class woman who behaves with constraint and reason. The second escape, though, is not just an escape from Franzos's image of the bourgeois educated woman. Esther simultaneously escapes from the existing social structure in Barnow that confines her. By reading secular literature, she rejects the limited intellectual life tradition that tradition affords her, and embraces new frontiers of emotional and social configurations in a world of fiction. While, on the one hand, the trope of the female reader of novels is a perennial figure of Fehlbildung, it also marks a general refusal to conform to existing social expectations. In this case, the piety and arranged marriage demanded by Esther's father. The problem in the Shylock of Barnow is, of course, not Bildung itself, but rather a concern with its proper development, an indictment of those who thwart it. As the judge's wife entertains her guests with Esther's tragic story, the party guests bemoan the reading of middlebrow literature and the wayward development of one's moral code from reading, for example, the collected works of French author Paul de Kock. Based on this reading, the lady of the house questions Esther's morality, and her guests assert that her cohort cannot possibly achieve lessons in morality through such a diet of literature. Paul de Kock was a 19th century French author who wrote many popular novels that appealed to middle-class readers and a growing reading public. They were cheaply translated and sold, making him the bourgeois writer par excellence. The author's name became synonymous with market success, and by the 1830s was also quoted with lowbrow or middlebrow literature among critics. Esther's reading is therefore not only a rejection of her pious father's expectations of propriety, her reading habits also scandalize the non-Jewish community members as they hear about her loose literary exploits. Her rebellion triggers fear at the intersection between two social changes, an abandonment of traditional Jewish learning and the transformation of aesthetic forms with the rise of capitalism and the middle class. Disapproval of Esther's reading in the age of mass-produced secular literature acts as a code for anxieties toward the control of her desire. She reads rapidly and indiscriminately, consuming texts that are quickly distributed to wide audiences. The 18th and 19th centuries opened new frontiers in the production and circulation of literary forms, and Esther eagerly throws herself into the unknown, and therefore morally dubious, terrain. The perceived moral deficiency of the work is found in its status as commodity, devalued by its mass production and its conferring of cultural capital, more than in the content of the work itself. This conception of reading as an obscure space where moral deficiency can hide shapes a cautionary image of partial Bildung. A group of townspeople listened to Esther's story with pity, and the local doctor, who acts as a sort of mouthpiece for the author, Franzos, remarks that Esther was not an agent of immoral behavior, but rather a victim of an incomplete education. The issue was deeper, much deeper. Just as twilight is more eerie than the night, so too is partial half-Bildung more ruinous than ignorance. Ignorance and the night, they keep the eye shut and the foot anchored in the soil. Knowledge in the daytime, they open the eye and let us happily stride forward. Partial knowledge in twilight, they take off only part of the bandage from the eye and let us step into the unknown and stumble. Poor child. In this assessment, it is perhaps better not to be educated at all than only partially. The doctor's warning against the dangers of half-Bildung echoes the scenes at night as Esther reads books in hiding. This half-Bildung is not dangerous because of its darkness, which the doctor argues allows for a measure of security in its stillness. Danger crystallizes only as darkness approaches the clarity of light. Half-Bildung is treacherous by inhabiting an ambiguous space, one that is neither held stable in ignorance nor propelled forward by knowledge. In the doctor's articulation, Esther has emerged from the darkness enough to compel her to move through the world with the pretense of clarity, when in reality, she fumbles through space with limited vision. The source of this partial education is, according to the doctor, the rapid proliferation and consumption of popular literature that only generate partial intellectual engagement. So, to bring our look at Franzos' text to a close, at the core of this mistrust of Franzos' anxiety towards the way in which Eastern European Jews might thwart the process of attaining a quote-unquote complete Bildung is the ideal central to Franzos' cultural project and a vision of modern Jewish life. Franzos harnesses the discourses of wider debates on education and the ideals of self-improvement to articulate a critique of his imagined shtetl and how the shtetl, as synecdoche for Eastern Europe, might undermine the ongoing project of achieving equality for Jews. Esther is thus the embodiment of Franzos' supposed half Asia, located between what he considers the unrefined East and a Western European ideal. The daughter thus emerges both as a corrupted agent and a victim, but her condition ultimately results from the circumstances created by her father, the one who denies her the secular education in the first place. The narrator reproaches Moses for Esther's unraveling, caused by shutting her off from the quote, the light and the world, unquote. The original offense, according to the author, was Moses's refusal to bring enlightenment to his daughter. While Franzos was an unabashed champion of the German cultural nation, the Kulturnation, Shylock hardly paves a clear path towards secular education and the rewards therein, because it does not imagine a positive form of Bildung, one that is ostensibly complete. Shylock attempts to paint a portrait of the redemptive potential of Bildung for traditional Jews precisely by presenting what Bildung is not. And I thank you very much for your time and sharing a bit of my work with you today.
Thank you, Leah. And we have some time for questions. You can either use the chat, or you can. We are a small group, so we can. You can just start to speak, or you can also raise your arm. This is all up to you. Jonathan, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if you think that the issue has been resolved today, or if the Jewish world has polarized between the Hasidim and we heirs of the Enlightenment, right? In liberal democracies, have we figured out how to stand in both worlds successfully?
I missed the first part of your question, but I think I have the gist of it. I would say that these issues are recurring issues, and I would say that nothing has been resolved, which is also why I've decided in the book project, now that I'm expanding it, to also think about how this particular paradigm recurs in contemporary literature and media. So I'll also be thinking about there's an entire subgenre of off the derech, off the path, off the Orthodox path literature that's quite popular, thinking about the memoir Unorthodox from Deborah Feldman and how that was then turned into a very popular series. Thinking also about the Israeli show Shtisel, which talks about the current interactions between the ultra-Orthodox and secular world in Israel. So I would say that this question has not been resolved, certainly not.
Are there novels in English that you read that deal with this, like Dara Horn or Jonathan Franzen? Or
I'm missing some of what you're saying, but in terms of this intersection of reading and moving away from traditional Judaism, I do know that although English literature is certainly, and American literature is not my expertise, but I know certainly The Romance Reader is a novel that deals with this in the context of the States, certainly Unorthodox as well.
Yeah, I think Jonathan mentioned also Dara Horn. Yeah.
I mean, does anybody have recommend? I'm thinking Rachel Kaddish. Are there any American Jewish writers that anyone would recommend, assuming that fiction, that literature has significant value here, that deal with this conflict between the two entities and different roles? Oh, well, okay, dead end question. Sorry.
No, I'm certain. I'm certain, as I'm not an Americanist, so I therefore don't feel that I have the expertise to offer recommendations in this particular field. But I'm certain that the Jewish daughter is a popular trope throughout Jewish literature of all kinds, and that can be seen in certainly in film. Barbra Streisand, for example. The Nanny. So I think that perhaps not exactly reflecting the sorts of cultural dynamics in the 19th century work that I work on, but I think that there must be a wealth out there, and I would defer to my colleagues in American literature and American studies who would have some more specific recommendations.
Kenneth.
I enjoyed your talk very much. I have a question about the painting that began your talk. There was a figure in between the girl in the background and the three in the front. And I don't recall that you discussed that figure. Could you do so now?
Yeah, there was one on the very left as well. What's that guy do? Can you bring it up?
Yeah, I also, as not an art historian, I can't speak to exactly which characters were being depicted in this particular image, but it appears that there is another member of the family who is also reclining on the Sabbath with the family, perhaps the woman in the background, sister, who's sitting there next to her grandmother and her brother and her father.
You don't think it's the mother?
It could also be the mother. Yeah, it is hard to age this this particular character. She also does look quite young, so that's why I would suggest perhaps it's her sister.
Okay, thank you.
But Moritz Daniel Oppenheim if you're interested in this particular genre of work, he depicted many scenes of the German Jewish middle class, weddings, other sort of indoor scenes of family gatherings at Jewish holidays that sort of combine the new middle class ideals with Jewish tradition.
Is there a place where his pictures are hung and you can see them?
I have not seen them in person. I do believe that some of them are located in, I want to say Los Angeles. However, I've especially during the pandemic not had the opportunity to venture out and go to where some of them are hung physically. So I'm fortunate for the internet and the distribution of these images.
Yeah, I think there are at several locations in both in Europe and in the US, and they were very popular to be have used as postcards and to be used in reproductions in many Jewish homes in the 19th century. And they're really interesting. I mean, they're really if you go into them, you really discover a lot. They're good objects to study also in classroom.
Hmm.
I think Daniela has a question, and she said, "Thanks you very much for your presentation. I have a question about your broader project. Franzos wrote in German, but I wonder how or if the representation of Jewish daughter figure changes based on which language the literature is written in. And do works written in Yiddish show a different depiction of the daughter?"
So, and this is something that obviously I wrestled with a lot in my work, and which is talking about German Jewish and Eastern European Yiddish literature together, while also considering that they come from vastly different cultural and intellectual contexts and social contexts. So talking about so most of my German texts come from the German-speaking world, either from Prussia or the Habsburg, former Habsburg Empire, whereas, say, looking at Sholem Aleichem, texts written in Yiddish are coming from the Russian Empire, which offers a different set of political and social dynamics and constraints. As you know, the trajectory of Jewish emancipation looks different throughout Europe. So in that way, it is different in that we're dealing with a new set of possibilities and issues at stake based on whether the Jewish daughter is located in the context of, say, Bohemia or Moravia, or Berlin versus present day, what was then the Russian Empire, so present day Ukraine and Russia. Does that sort of address the question you're asking? Yeah, so I would be excited also to share with you sort of my work on Sholem Aleichem and the different challenges and opportunities that are presented Tevye the dairyman's various daughters. So one is following a socialist revolutionary, and one is falling in love with the Russian author Maxim Gorky. So those are some of the challenges that the Jewish daughter faces. And of course, the level of piety is very different that we're dealing with as well, in most of these texts compared to the sort of middle class German literature in the 19th century.
Yeah, I wonder, just to follow up on Daniela's question, I know that you also worked on theater plays, and I thought maybe you can just mention briefly the German and German Yiddish theater plays you included in your dissertation as well, and I hope you will include in your book.
Yeah, I think what I enjoyed most about working with those texts that you mentioned, those are the plays written in Western Yiddish and German from the late 18th century during the Jewish Enlightenment and the Haskalah, which show the interaction and the sort of fluidity between German and Western Yiddish in terms of their mutual intelligibility, because Western Yiddish being closer to Hochdeutsch, High German, than say the Eastern Yiddish that is spoken or written in Sholem Aleichem's works. So in those ways, it shows the ability to code switch between High German or the attempts at code switching between High German and Yiddish or vice versa of the Jewish daughter. And that's what I'm particularly interested in looking at, is the Jewish daughter's attempt to enter into the what is sort of modeled as salon culture of Berlin, and to speak to move her Western Yiddish into the realm of High German in order to conform to new social and cultural demands, and the desire to enter into this new realm of more quote unquote acculturated society. And so I look at how her language operates as a signal for her rebellion from the family and from tradition, whereas many of the men in these texts are depicted as speaking Western Yiddish and using a higher lexicon of Hebrew words, Loshen Kodesh words that are derived from the Holy Tongue.
Thanks a lot. And I have also put in the chat a link to one of Oppenheim's paintings, which is in the Magnus collection at Berkeley. But I think there are many other places you can find this in. So I don't see any other question at the moment. I thank Leah very much for your talk, for the insight into 19th century German literature written about the Jewish daughters. And I hope you will find many more rebellious Jewish daughters in the future, in your future research. And thank you everyone for coming. And Talia, maybe you can show us the upcoming events, which will be we'll still host this semester. We're looking forward to, in 10 days, to a talk by Ana Elena Torres from the University of Chicago. And this will be also held on Zoom. Good evening, everyone, and I hope to see you soon.